The most painful thing anyone can do to you leaves no fingerprints. It doesn't shout. It doesn't send you an angry message in the middle of the night. It doesn't give you something visible to defend yourself against, something to argue back at, something concrete to point to when you try to explain to a friend why you feel so unsettled. The most painful thing anyone can do to you is simply become slightly colder. Slightly more distant. Slightly less warm than they were yesterday, and just enough for you to notice it, but never quite enough for you to be certain. And in that narrow space of uncertainty, something deeply disorienting happens. You stop looking at them. You start interrogating yourself. This is worth pausing on. Because most people, when they experience sudden emotional distance from someone they care about, instinctively assume they've done something wrong. They replay conversations. They search backwards for the moment, for the word that landed wrong, for the expression that shifted something. They become patient detectives of their own behavior, sifting through recent memories for the crime they must have committed. And the person who withdrew? They don't have to say a single word. They don't have to explain, accuse, or confront. They simply wait. And watch you work. Here is something that very few people are ever taught: sudden emotional distance is rarely a spontaneous emotional reaction. It is, far more often than people recognize, a chosen position. There is a meaningful difference between someone pulling away because they are genuinely hurt and someone pulling away because they have discovered, consciously or not, that pulling away produces results. One is vulnerability. The other is architecture. And the tragedy is that from the outside, they are nearly impossible to tell apart. What makes this so psychologically disorienting is that human beings are not merely wired to enjoy connection. They require warmth the way they require safety. When someone close to you withdraws their emotional presence without explanation, the nervous system does not register it as a preference or a mood. It registers it as a threat. The body responds to relational coldness with something close to the same urgency it reserves for physical danger. A mind in that state doesn't reason clearly. It bargains. It accommodates. It quietly begins rearranging its own positions, softening stances, abandoning arguments, apologizing for things it hasn't quite done, all in the effort to restore the warmth that was withheld. A calculated mind understands this. Not necessarily through deliberate study. Not through articulated strategy. But through something older and more instinctive, the lived discovery that withdrawing emotional warmth bends people in ways that confrontation never could. That silence reshapes behavior more reliably than argument. That coolness, precisely where there was once closeness, creates a kind of gravitational pull, drawing the other person into a state of anxious reaching. And a reaching person compromises. A reaching person over-explains. A reaching person quietly dismantles their own position not because they were convinced, but because the alternative, continued emotional distance, feels like something they cannot survive. This is the invisible architecture of a calculated dynamic, not the dramatic confrontation, but the steady conditioning that happens in the space between those moments. Each time you sense that distance and respond by softening your tone, changing your position, or apologizing for a crime that was never clearly named, a pattern is reinforced. Each time warmth is restored after you've adjusted, the lesson is etched a little deeper. And eventually you stop noticing that you are doing this. The accommodation becomes reflex. You begin to believe, genuinely believe, that certain topics are simply not worth raising. That certain feelings are genuinely too heavy for the relationship to hold. That certain needs are unreasonable at their core. But none of that is true. What is true is that you were trained, not by cruelty, but by pattern. The most effective control doesn't look like control. It looks like your own restraint. And here is where the perspective must shift entirely, because the most unsettling part of this is never what was done to you. It is what you learn to do to yourself in response. The human mind is extraordinarily adaptive. When a certain behavior consistently produces warmth and another consistently produces distance, the mind adjusts without asking your permission and without announcing what it is doing. It begins to quietly suppress whatever triggered the coldness. It amplifies whatever restored the connection. Over time, you don't just modify your behavior around this person, you modify your inner landscape. You stop feeling certain things. You stop needing certain things. And you mistake that suppression for maturity. There is a particular kind of silence that a calculated mind deploys, not the silence of peace, but the silence of withholding. It arrives precisely when reassurance was most expected. It takes the form of a response that doesn't come, of engagement replaced by indifference at the exact moment vulnerability was shown, of a question left hanging in a room that suddenly feels much colder. What this silence communicates is never spoken aloud. It doesn't need to be. The message lands below language, somewhere older than words. Your emotional needs are burdensome. Your desire for closeness costs too much. Your uncertainty about where you stand is something the other person finds inconvenient. And the most devastating consequence of absorbing that message repeatedly is not anger at the person who delivered it. It is shame about the need itself. You can understand something intellectually and still be governed by it emotionally. This is perhaps the cruelest design of the pattern. A person can recognize every behavior being described here, name it precisely, trace its contours with clarity, and still, in the presence of that particular silence from that particular person, feel the old pull rising. Still feel the urge to reach out, to smooth over, to make the distance smaller at any cost. Because the conditioning doesn't live in the rational mind where recognition happens. It lives in the body. In the nervous system. In the places where warmth once felt like safety and became, over time, indistinguishable from love itself. This is why clarity alone is not the end of anything. Recognition is necessary, but it is only an entrance. What must happen after recognition is something quieter and slower and far less dramatic than the moment of naming, the gradual relearning of what genuine safety actually feels like. Because if the only peace available within a relationship was the kind that required your own diminishment to access, then real stillness will feel suspicious. Consistency will feel flat. Warmth that asks nothing in return will feel, at first, like a trick. And that is not a character flaw. That is the perfectly coherent result of a nervous system that was taught to associate emotional intensity with love, and relief from anxiety with intimacy. The person who taught you that silence could be used as punishment gave you something you did not ask for, the capacity, eventually, to recognize what its opposite feels like by contrast. Not the silence that withholds. Not the quiet that tests. But the kind of presence that doesn't shift based on whether you are behaving correctly. The kind of warmth that doesn't need to be earned back. The kind of connection that does not require you to be smaller than you are to sustain it. What is taken from you inside a calculated dynamic is not only your comfort. What is taken is your access to your own inner judgment. When your sense of safety has been repeatedly linked to another person's emotional approval, you lose the ability to trust yourself as a reliable reader of your own experience. You outsource your compass to someone whose primary skill was making you feel as though you needed them to navigate. And the work of reclaiming that compass, the real work, the unglamorous kind, is the work of learning to sit inside your own uncertainty without immediately reaching outward for resolution. Of discovering that you can survive the silence. That the silence was never actually punishment. It was information. The calculated withdrawal of warmth works only on people who deeply feel. On people who take connection seriously, who assign real weight to intimacy, who genuinely care about the people they allow close. It does not work on the indifferent. It has no grip on the emotionally detached. It moves only those who are, at their core, genuinely open. And there is something worth holding in that, because the capacity that made you vulnerable to this was never the weakness it was made to appear. It was the best part of you, being used against you. You were not too much. You were simply in the wrong proximity, being made to feel that way. If something in these words landed in a place that felt like recognition, a place you've lived in but rarely had language for, that recognition is not small. The mind that can finally see clearly is the mind that begins to choose differently, not overnight, but steadily. If this kind of conversation feels like coming home to a part of yourself you forgot to guard, there is more here waiting for you. Subscribe and stay close, because the most important things about how we love, how we lose ourselves, and how we find our way back rarely get said out loud, and they deserve to be.